Welcome everyone to this very special book launch event for Kirun Kapur, Women in the Waiting Room. I'm Daisy from 5x15 and it's great to have lots of people logging in. I know we've got people from all over the world joining us, and well done everyone for getting the time difference right. Our clocks have changed and we were all trying to figure it out, but it is fantastic for us to be hosting this. And I wanted to just say that the book is available from Black Lawrence Press and also from Amazon, and I will share the details in the chat. There is also a Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screens. You should be able to see it, and you can put your questions in there, and Erica is going to be asking lots of those as we go along today. So Erica Wagner is our chair today. She is an acclaimed writer and a critic. She was the literary editor of The Times for 17 years. She's been the chair of the Man Booker Prize twice, and she's also contributing editor now for Harper's Bazaar and writer at the New Statesman and the Financial Times, as well as many, many other publications. And she's the author of the acclaimed book, The Chief Engineer, about Washington Roebling. We've been very lucky to work with Erica at 5x15, and we've always loved hearing her. And it's a great honor to be able to host this event this evening, or today where you are. So we are really looking forward to it. And I will hand over now to Erica. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Daisy. And it is really wonderful to be here this evening, this afternoon, wherever we are, hosted by 5x15 and launching Kirun Kapur's wonderful book, Women in the Waiting Room. I am going to introduce her. We will chat. She will read some of her marvelous poems. And then, as Daisy said, you can ask your questions through me at any time that they occur to you. Please drop them into the Q&A function, which I will keep looking at and salt your questions throughout our conversation. So, excuse me, as I said, I'm so delighted to be here with Kirun, whose newest book, Women in the Waiting Room, was a finalist for the National Poetry Series and has just been published by Black Lawrence Press. Poet Aimee Nezhukumatathil called it a must-read for these times and beyond. Kirun's first collection, Visiting Indira Gandhi's Palmist, was hailed by Dubus III as a stellar debut by a major new voice. It was awarded the 2013 Antivenom Poetry Award, and was a finalist for the Mass Book Prize, the Julie Suk Award, and several other prizes. In 2015, NBC News put her on their list of Asian American poets to watch, and she has clearly gone on from strength to strength. She grew up in Hawaii and has since lived and worked in North America and South Asia. Her first job as a writer was for India's groundbreaking feminist magazine, Manushi, and she has traveled widely since. Stateside, her work has appeared in such journals as Ploughshares, AGNI, Poetry International, Prairie Schooner, and many other magazines and news outlets. She has taught creative writing at Boston University, Brandeis University, and has been granted fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Vermont Studio Center, and MacDowell Colony. She sits on the editorial board of the Bewat Poetry Journal, one of the nation's oldest poetry publications. I should say, when I say the nation, I mean United States. I myself am in London. And she is a poetry editor for the Drum Literary magazine, which publishes short fiction, poetry, essays, novel excerpts, and interviews exclusively in audio form, something I might well ask her about. She teaches now at Amherst and lives north of Boston with her family, and she has a great website, which is kirunkapur.com. It's really great to be here with you today and to have met you virtually. And I'm really thrilled to participate in this launch. So welcome.
Thank you. It's such a treat to be with you today.
Tell us a little bit about, before we perhaps hear some poems, about the genesis of this collection, which published in 2020 seems astonishingly timely to me, but how did it begin to come together for you?
I wish I could say that I set out to write this book, or any particular book really. But honestly, I find poems to be so difficult and miraculous to make that my focus is always really narrow. I work from poem to poem, and if I feel that a poem has gone well and that it might come to life, I think, oh, well, maybe I'll try my hand at another one. And so in this way, I sort of go, from poem to poem, and I'm quite a long ways down in the process before I sort of look up and try to think about what a group of poems might be about, if they could be a book, if they're talking to each other in some way, and if so, about what. So I can't so much say that I set out to write this as I sort of discovered I was in the process of writing it. But when I began to look more broadly at the poems, I think I felt that they were all poems about moments when we struggle to speak for whatever reason, be it illness or violence or fear or even love. I think love can render us speechless often. But there are a whole host of human experiences that make us feel like we don't know who we are or how to say who we are or how to say what's happened or what's happening to us. So all of these poems kind of depart, I think, from that moment. And it was that kind of realization that brought the book together.
I think that's a really fascinating question for writers, both I think for poets, also I think when I talk to writers of short stories, the way that a collection or a group of pieces can come together. I'm interested, I want to kind of explore maybe a little bit more what you say about the way that the pieces, the way you feel that the pieces speak to each other, and perhaps how you draw on personal experience and external experience to create not just poems, but a book. Can you say a little more about that?
I think the process of making a book is, for me, kind of different than making an individual poem. Making a book often for me is a process of elimination, right? Of finding the shape inside, many poems. I made many other poems that aren't in this book kind of during the same period of time. So it's a matter of kind of pruning and, finding the shape somehow in the midst of a whole lot of poems, which not all of which are pointed in the same direction or are speaking to each other. So in that sense, it feels different than making an individual poem. But it's similar in that I hope that once you begin to put poems side by side, there's some kind of friction, some kind of spark that's generated. And that's true, in an individual poem as well, right? Words and lines, and you're looking for those moments where a spark brings a poem to life. So I think once I start to think, oh, here are 40 poems, and do they have something to say to each other? I'm looking for those moments of connection and disconnection that generate some kind of energy, in the whole.
Well, why don't we hear some of this wonderful poetry? I know you have a selection to read, so maybe one or two poems to begin with.
Sure. I thought I'd just start at the beginning, which makes sense. This first poem is not only the first poem in the book, but it's a poem about a first story, a foundational story, really. This poem thinks about the great Hindu epic poem, the Ramayana. That story, of course, is not just about its namesake, Lord Ram, but about his wife, Sita, who in the course of the story is carried away by a demon. And much of the poem meditates on what may or may not have happened to her, and about whether the order of the world and issues of justice, both divine justice and human justice, those are all connected to her fate. So this is on looking at myself in the mirror, or rereading Valmiki's Ramayana. Anyone can disappear across the black water. Every girl can be taught. Her middle name is shame. When will I burn the urge for purity? My bones are a furnace. My face is a game. Every girl steals away with a demon at some point. All her alphabets, Uncle Bells, all her braids. She will meet herself in the third person. She will lie with her fear. She will dress in her rage. The world is curdled by husbands, blue as the gods, gentle as flame.
Thank you.
I'll maybe read one more to start us off.
Yes, that would be good.
As you mentioned, I grew up in Hawaii. And whenever I tell people that, they say either, oh, Hawaii is so beautiful, or is it really that beautiful? There's a certain amount of disbelief about it. And it is, in fact, just that beautiful. But it's also a lot of other things. And this poem thinks about that. It has a lot of initials in it, M and L. You'll hear those initials. And of course, that troubled initial I. Girls, girls, girls. Along the strip in Waikiki, past sailor bars and clubs, the length of beach where lipstick sunsets smudged and magazines would shoot and caption paradise. Past posh hotels, where M and I would wait for some nice man to buy us a drink from the bar. We'd watch the women walk like they were stars on stage, dress like they couldn't wait to be undressed, leaning over into idling cars. Out on the west side of the island, Jay tells me any man she dates is more likely to hit her than pay for her dinner. Teenagers holding babies spit at us when we stare. What you looking at? You got nothing. I have nothing, sobs L today on the phone. I know it isn't my fault, but when I think of how I let him do it, over and over, even helped him cover it up, I hate myself. I'm thinking of the man who owned the noodle shop, the man who'd always sit with me and chat about Hanoi, warm water in canals, moms on bikes, babies tied down front and back, how to test a ripe papaya. I saw him on the news a few years back for smuggling women in refrigerated trucks. He owned the bar called Girls, 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 a few doors down from where he served me pho, the one whose sign was made of neon legs that kicked and kicked until they were a stain of light. We liked to swim along the South Shore when the tide was right. You had to time your dive or crack your head against a reef. More than once, a girl washed up. Sometimes they named her on the news. Em and I drank kamikazes on the lanai of the new Sheraton. The chief of security coming out to check we were the right sort of girls, regaling us with stories of the wallets stolen off of businessmen by ladies visiting their rooms, a theft they'd later blame on the hotel maid. I hate Elle's voice, mine. When I think of how many times have I said it? How many times have I said nothing at all, or tried to explain why we aren't at home, the right sort of girl and the wrong, why we're all out under the orange streetlights.
Thank you very much. Thinking about both of those poems, each very different, but one of them, as you said, lifting off from the Ramayana, from this great myth. And then you alluded in your introduction to the second poem to the kind of myth of Hawaii, of people have an idea of it, it's so beautiful. And you give this very particular portrait, specific, seeming to be a portrait from memory. How important is it to you to, reading this collection, I thought of myths and the undercutting of myths. That's something that came out to me in this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, I think myths, that we think of grand myths, the old myths, the myths we know and share, but we live in the present tense in a lot of myths as well. Whether it's a myth about paradise in a particular place, or a myth about our own safety in the world. We tell ourselves a lot of stories, and these stories are incredibly powerful and life-saving, and also obscuring, right? And I think one of the things that poetry tries to do is to draw up that contrast, right? To help us see the places where myth illuminates and kind of opens the door to deeper meaning, and the places where it obscures truth and experience. And I think I hope to do both of those in poems. I hope all poems do that.
Wonderful. And one thing, a line that jumped out at me from the first poem you talk about, you say her middle name is Shame. And shame is also a theme to me that runs through this book. What are the challenges of speaking about shame? The nature of shame is that it is unspoken, it seems to me.
Well, I think all of these poems wrestle with that, being right at that sort of precipice of experience where you can't find a way to say what's true. And shame is one of the experiences I think that puts us there. Grief, loss, violence, illness. There are so many, I think, human experiences which bring us to that point. And some of it I think has to do with the existential questions that moment brings to us, about meaning, whether there's meaning in our experience, whether we can go forward and survive in that experience, issues of order, right? Somehow violence, shame, illness, they all force us to question the sort of ordering structures of the world, cause and effect, logic, all of those sorts of things become somehow up for grabs. And then we find it difficult to find language for that moment. So I think that poetry is always at a crossroads of contradiction. And so it's so good at talking about things like shame, things that feel unspeakable, right? Poetry is, on the one hand, incredibly intimate and private, right? We make it with our breath. We make it with our body, right? The poet makes it first with their breath and body, and then the reader brings it to life with theirs. And between the poet and the reader is a shared body, right? And we make the words with our mouths. Like, I don't know anything more intimate than that. On the other hand, poetry, I think, also is part of our great communal instinct to share stories, right? The earliest stories are all oral communal tales, right? We tell the tribe's story in order to ensure its survival, right? So poetry is always at this sort of crossroads of contradiction, and it's always kind of bringing to life contradictory forces somehow in its body, right? And if a poem can contain that contradiction and can create life out of those opposing forces, I think it makes it a perfect vessel for struggling with the need to articulate and the fear of articulation, the difficulty of saying what's true, and the silence that stops us from saying what's true.
I love that idea of the kind of the shared breath between the poet and the reader, that point of exchange. But what you're just saying about that, the choice to speak, makes me come to a question posed by our mutual friend, Mark Van Honecker, who introduced us and brought this together, and who I met through his wonderful book, Skyfaring. And he said, when you started this book, it must have been hard to imagine just how timely these themes of choosing to speak would be to readers in 2020. I'm thinking about the events that have happened around Me Too, around Black Lives Matter. What is it like to have been working on a book, putting it together for a long time, and then it appears right now, and indeed here we are, not together because of a pandemic?
That's a great question. I think I always resist a little bit the idea that this is a timely topic. And I think it's because, as I started with the Ramayana, right? I mean, that's from the 5th century BCE. And if we look at all our great and oldest books, this is a serious topic in all of them. I mean, right, the Iliad is launched by the fate of a woman. Greek mythology is full of the stories of what happens to women and their bodies. The Bible is full of, Dinah and Tamar, and Deuteronomy has long passages about captives of war, women captives of war. So we have been meditating and thinking about this topic for a long time. And in more recent times, of course, so many women have done the hard work of talking about it. And so I don't think that it is a new topic. I do think that we encounter this topic over and over as though it is a shock, as though it is new. I think that's quite a curious phenomenon. On the one hand, every time you turn on the TV, the first minutes of how many TV shows include a woman's body, right? Something that's happened to a woman's body. So on the one hand, right, we're really comfortable watching it, seeing it. It's been in our literature, in our imaginations for so long. And yet every time it becomes public in a new way, we're shocked. And we think, oh, it's timely, oh, it's new. When in fact, it's an eternal conversation. Certainly, I'm happy to see more people speak and feel that they can speak. And I hope that's one of the things that this book does, right? That it makes a space for speech about illness, about violence, about trauma, about all of those things. And also for silence, right? Silence is, right, again, one of these contradictions I hope that poetry can contain, and that we need to, I think of in better ways, right? I think it's Meryl Rukeyser, right, who says, you know, what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life, right? The world would split open, right? And she says it in 1968. And women have been doing the hard work of telling that truth for a long time, but I'm not sure we're doing the hard work of listening, right? And silence can be, on the one hand, an oppressive force, right? A force that stops us from speaking, but it also is the only way that we can listen. So, you know, it's my hope that these poems too contain spaces for listening, and perhaps make us better listeners and caretakers in silence.
I think that's a fascinating point too about what we do and do not notice what's in front of our eyes all the time. And it's absolutely true in these times when we've all been at home a lot more, and I think perhaps watching more TV than we would have been ordinarily. I, for the first time, started to notice watching, terrific crime shows on, arty crime shows. And I finally began to kind of lay bets with myself. Let's see if there's a beautiful dead girl at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's the beginning of every story, a beautiful dead girl. And you don't even notice.
Right, we don't even notice. And when they come to the news, by some miracle, people are shocked, right? And I have conversations all the time with people who will say to me, I'm sure I've never met someone who has been assaulted, for instance, and I often know them well enough to know that that's just not the truth, because I know some wider group of their friends. But even if I don't, statistically, it's almost impossible. And yet I think that comes back to your point about myths, right? That I think that's one of the myths that we maintain, maybe for our own security, but also to the detriment and at great risk for others.
Yes, that we keep it over there. Before, I'm going to ask you to read a couple more poems. Before I do, though, we're storing up some questions in the Q&A. Please do put your questions in the Q&A and I will come to them. But can we have a couple more poems?
Yes, definitely. Maybe sort of taking off from the comment about dead girls and visions of them. Let's start with this one. Hotline. I have been trained. So when she says, I watched my father smash my mother's forehead with a wooden broom handle, I show no sign of shock. The poet liked to say, you shouldn't borrow sorrow, write real things, dishpans, porch screens, broom handles. Give me a humble trash bag. For years, this face I trained my mind to unsee. Cheek eaten away by fish. Girl body washed up in the canal, wrapped. The brand identified as glad. No scars, birthmarks, clothes, jewelry. 5'2", 133 precisely. My own height and weight. Police were saying, was she sure it was a broom handle, metal or wooden? We need the details right. How could a wooden handle do all that? The poet suggests, make it a skillet. I believe he killed her with a skillet, if you must. On the page, I describe lilies wilting in a vase, because I have been trained, because you have been trained. Can you believe? 6 glistening stamens, smashed rust velvet anthers.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll switch gears for a minute. I have a great love of deserts, and our mutual friend and I have been to many a desert together, actually. And this desert is the largest contiguous desert, sand desert, I think, in the world. It lies between Oman and Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And this poem takes its title from there. In the Rub al-Khali. 1. You'll want to cover yourself. The morning cry from the muezzin strips the sky. Ptolemy was first to reveal the desert's entry gate to the world, calling Muscat hidden harbor. You believe all any person wants is to be seen, but here you stand under the cloudless eye and know how Eve and Adam felt. Sweet and tart fruit lashed their mouths, transforming them, bare to exposed. Wrap up your frankincense, your bridal chest of meteor stones, in layer after layer of earthly cloth. When the day has glazed you in its kiln, when you are the only vertical line crossing the horizon, it's a relief to kneel, drench your face in fine red sand. Let's feed each other a bowl of dates. Let's build a courtyard garden surrounded by high walls. Before the first prayer ends and dawn blinds us with its charge, let's trap the darkness, hold all its stars under our shawls. 2. If satellites patrol our heaven, if beetles leave encrypted tracks around our sleeping mats for 1,000 mornings, if our story orbits back to when the desert was the ocean, if you put your mouth to me like a jellyfish, like a diesel kiss, like I am a bottle of well water, if we crush each other like a reef whose happy ending is to be reborn as dunes, beloved, caravan, sweet eon, wind erosion, if it hasn't rained in years, we'll live on miraculous green shoots, as when our vows were new.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much. And that actually brings me to a question we have from an audience member, from Deborah Bennett, who says the question of place seems to be so important in your work. Can you talk about your sense of place and why it's important in your work and in poetry in general?
Sure, yeah. I grew up between many places, I think. And so I think maybe that makes you particularly interested in the details of individual places, but also in the movement between places. You know, I think I'm always interested in the kinds of details that nail us to the moment, right? Details in writing are what create an embodied experience for the reader. And so they're incredibly important. They're also important to all kinds of issues of identity, which I think is a topic that has been important to me. And so out of those concerns, I think place comes up a lot in my work. But I think it's important for any poem, right? Those granular details that locate a reader in space and in time and place them straight up against the moment are just crucial for good poetry.
And your work is wonderful in that way of using granular detail. In Hotline, one of the things that really strikes me is that line about smashing the mother's forehead with a wooden broom handle, which is unpoetic language, which you address in the poem by referring to the poet. How do you strike that balance between the granular, the unpoetic, and yet creating poetry from it?
Well, I think often our instinct is to use poetic language. I think in this collection in particular, I was interested in language that is usually outside of the realm of poetry. You know, Frost says, a poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom. And I think these poems are interested in the problem of what happens when you can't begin in delight, right? What happens when you begin in sorrow or pain or grief, right? How then does a poem proceed? And how does a person proceed? That's a different aesthetic question than sometimes we wrestle with in poems. So this book in particular, I think, sought to bring in a conscious way, a wider range of speech, and particularly speech that is unpoetic. In that case, the detail, in fact, comes back to our previous point or conversation about shock, right? I think we all have an instinct for a certain kind of decorum, right? And to avoid something that shocks. But often our life experience isn't that way. And if poetry can't incorporate that language, if it can't speak to those moments, I don't know what it's doing. I think poetry has to speak to our most urgent, most important experiences. And that will include details and events that are shocking and unpoetic, and asks, what can we make of that, right? How do we proceed from that? Can we make delight and wisdom? Can we travel forward from that?
Wonderful. I have another question here from Jacob Stroutman, which will lead me to ask about your first book, Visiting Indira Gandhi's Palmist. He says how much he loves these poems. What new pressures or freedoms did you find in building your second book in light of your first? So maybe you could talk a bit about the connections between these two books.
Well, I think both of these books are interested in experience that's difficult to talk about. My first book was about family, really, but not just my own family, although they were some of the stories that came from my family are in the circulation system of that book, but also just families in general. All our greatest myths and stories, they're family stories, right? Genesis is one long family drama. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, right? These ancient Hindu epics, they all start out with family dynamics, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers. Greek mythology, right? Everywhere you look in the world, those are the first stories. And there too, quite often there are details that shock the myth, I think. And in particular in that story, in that book, I was interested in part in my family's own experience of the partition of India and Pakistan, which I think was a great shock to that nation from which it has never recovered, really. Right, it was the largest human migration in modern times. And in the space of just a few months, close to 22 million people crossed the borders as British India dissolved and the modern nation states of India and Pakistan were born. And in that short time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 million people lost their lives. I think both of these books are interested in how we can take in, how we can make space, how we can find a way to talk about things that we find difficult to talk about in public spaces, let alone in poetry books, for sure. But in terms of new freedoms, I think I very much wanted to make more room inside of poems in this new collection. The first collection, I think, stayed close to the idea of storytelling. So many of the stories, certainly of my family, came to me as stories told out loud. And I wanted to honor those shapes and voices. Here, many of the voices can't complete their stories and need space and silence and room to interrupt themselves and restart and listen. So I wanted to find a shape on the page that could do that. So this book, I think, contains different kinds of forms and structures. There's a lot of fragmentation. There are ghazals, which I think are wonderful poems for creating cohesion and also open space.
Maybe describe that, because that's a form I love. Maybe just describe that what that form
Sure.
entails.
Yes, well, the ghazal, of course, you know, reaches its apotheosis in Persian and Urdu poetry, although it comes from Arabic poetry. You know, it's a form that has a very tight set of restrictions. It's composed in couplets, and each couplet has a rhyme and a refrain, the kafia and radif. And so you have a repeating word and a rhyming word in each couplet. But the couplets themselves are not necessarily linked formally. So in between them is a lot of narrative space that isn't filled, right? The reader has to make those connections. So you have a kind of tight formal bond and a loose bond of meaning. And that tension, I think, is wonderful in the ghazal. So I was interested in that in this book, and in that sense of cohesion and explosion and space.
I'll take another question which follows on from that before I ask you to read again, which is an anonymous questioner asks, could you share more about your process in doing your work? So how you actually craft your poems, perhaps how you choose form or decide to break apart form. If you could say something about your practice, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, as I said, I spend a lot of time not knowing what I'm doing. And I think actually the more I make poems, the longer I write, the more I understand that the poems are best if I can hold off knowing what I'm doing for longer. The minute I have ideas about what a poem is about or what it should be, is the moment that all the possibilities end. So a lot of my practice is really just reminding myself that it's okay not to know what I'm doing, and to wait for the shape of the poem to announce itself in some way. I start from kind of all sorts of places. Sometimes it's a line, sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's a set of sounds. And then I just work word to word, line to line, usually until I begin to feel some music. For me, music is the center of poetry, and a poem can't live if it doesn't have music. So I wait until I hear something I recognize as the music of the poem, and then it takes off from there. My central metaphor for my own poem making is those early pictures of flight, you know, where they're like running down the beach and waiting for lift to take place, and for this unwieldy, amazing structure to somehow be in the air. And I think that's how I feel when I make a poem, that I'm frantically running and hoping that at a certain point, there'll be some lift, there'll be something will catch, and it will bring the poem to life.
That's wonderful. I like that metaphor very much. Why don't we hear a couple more poems?
Sure. Well, let's see. Maybe we should hear a ghazal, since we just talked about them. Let's see here. I'm getting to break the spine of the book for the first time, which feels a little bit exciting. This is called Red Lily's Ghazal. A chain of crushed nouns has upended my mind. It's okay, it's all right, pretended my mind. A quick cut, a small nick, a surgical touch. Oh, pентadine, tramadol, so splendid my mind. Ram drew back the string of King Junek's great bow. Sita shot through the lifetimes and tended my mind. Monkeys and blossoms, a long metal spine. In the void, Frida's paintings befriended my mind. 5 parrots dive bombing the picun tree. A sharp song, a green wingspan extended my mind. The boat swamped with water. She lost hold of his hand. Now she waits for a country that's abandoned its mind. Red lilies lie drowned in a blizzard of snow. Dear world, your bright terms have offended my mind. What I, which she, who's writing this self? A girl, years of girls have escaped from my mind. Maybe I'll read a poem from the center of the book. The center of this book is a long sequence of poems, and gives the book its title, Women in the Waiting Room. And it's a kind of love poem, really, but a love poem to a friendship. And it's also about illness, mortal illness, and the questions that arise from that, right? And how speech and silence become a vital part of surviving. Women in the Waiting Room. Women in the waiting room wear turquoise headscarves, jade shawls, lemon yellow teas, ongoing their commitment to the flourishing world. The hair goes, the breasts go, the ovaries gone, the uterus and fallopian tubes. This is the waiting room of philosophers, straightening lilac wraps, discerning where the self resides, without nipples or brows or two arms likely to be the same width. Once I was caught shoplifting teal eyeshadow. Waiting at the station for my father, I was told that in some countries, my hand would be cut off for what I'd done. There was no imagining, blind shock, blind ache, but I understood the shame of being punished that way, as if my pride depended on remaining whole. My father was so angry, he didn't speak for weeks. And so I learned the part of me that can't survive without his voice. You, my friend, who have loved me, when I couldn't do that work myself, are being wheeled away. I cling to your hand, and then the bed rail, and then stand in the fluorescent hall, while in your light blue gown, you go.
Thank you, that's wonderful. I'll come to a question from Rachel DeWaskin, who asks, Kirun, the lines in your poems are incredibly precise and distilled, and often the rhyme is internal to the line, almost hidden, a beautiful surprise. Can you talk about form, about how you make the lines their best versions and how you choose the shapes of individual poems? You talked a little bit, of course, about guzzles, but perhaps moving beyond that to talk about form more broadly.
I think all poems have form. Sometimes when we talk about form, we think of received form, right? Sonnets and villanelles, but every poem has a form and a body. And I tend to think of the lines of a poem sort of the way you might sand something down, right? Where you run your hands over it and over it again and again until the shape and the smoothness feels right. And that's very much the way I think of finding the form of a poem, is returning to its individual words and lines over and over again. You know, and eventually the shape of that begins to feel right in your hands and in your ear and in your mouth. So much of poems is saying them out loud. I say my poems as I make them. The sensation you have as your mouth moves over individual words, the line of a poem being related to the length of your breath. All those factors are part of finding the form of a poem, I think. You know, each poem, I think, has its own demands, right? It demands its own kind of container, really. You learn that just by going, really. You have to follow it word to word, line to line, breath to breath, sound to sound, until the shape begins to feel as if it can contain all that it needs to.
That actually, and because you were talking earlier about oral forms, the earliest form of poetry being storytelling, the great myths and the great epics. And I referred in my introduction to your editing of this online magazine, The Drum, which of course is all spoken. But I suppose I want to open up that question a bit more broadly, because you edit, you work as an editor on this magazine, you teach. How do you, it's a question for all writers, how you balance your writing life and your other life? But to me, the question is, because I do both as well, how do they feed each other for you? Your teaching, your editing, how does that come into your poetic work?
Well, teaching is wonderful in the sense that students keep you on your toes. They ask all the most important basic questions that you should never get away from. So I find, students really help me think over and over again about ways to articulate the most important things about making poems and reading poems. And they also keep me reading, which is also wonderful. I think you can't make good poems if you don't read. My students' reading and the questioning they do about their reading always deepens my sense of how to read a poem, how to write a poem, how to think about poetry. Editing, too, I think is a great education. I work with The Drum and also with another magazine that you mentioned, the Beloit Poetry Journal. And there in particular, we have a very elaborate and wonderful editorial process, which involves reading all the poems which have made it kind of to the final levels of consideration for publication. We read them out loud and we talk about them. And that's another moment where you have to re-articulate what is essential about a poem and what a poem is doing or trying to do. And I think those things just make you a better reader, writer, thinker about books and writing. In terms of balancing, I like a certain amount of chaos in my work, not so much in my private life, but in my work life. I find the energy of moving from project to project to be really enlivening. I'm, working on editing and teaching and translating and on new poems, and they all talk to each other. And often I think when you turn aside from something that you've been working on or banging your head against, that's the moment where you've created a vacuum and in rushes the answer to the question you were looking for. So I try to practice turning aside as often as possible and kind of moving from one set of interesting problems to another.
Yes, that mirrors my own experience, I would say, and certainly you're never bored if you live your life that way. Never. That leads me though to actually a practical question from Anne Rankin asks, given the thousands of literary journals out there, what's the best way for beginning poets to find places to publish? She asks, and there's so many places, there isn't a kind of finalized index. Do you have any suggestions?
Sure. It is daunting to see the sheer vast number of journals, but it also should be, I think, encouraging. There are so many places, especially now, looking for writers, especially new writers. So I think really dealing with journals is a matter of fortitude more than anything else. I don't know any writers who love the process of getting published, really. I think it's difficult for everyone. And a lot of it is just enduring until, one door opens. And very much, I think, way leads on to way with publication. And we, once one thing starts to happen, something else starts to happen. And then you begin to build a little feeling that if it happened once, it might happen again. And that helps. In terms of specific journals, certainly both Beloit and The Drum welcome new writers and often publish new writers. But there are so many. I think you should think of journals that you want to be in, even if they seem sort of out of reach, and try them anyway. And then also try places where you notice that a lot of the writers are publishing for the first time or are newer writers. And you may find the door that opens first is a surprise to you.
That's wonderful, thank you. I'm mindful of the time, and I know that you have, I think, a couple more poems to read. So can we have those now?
Yes, sure. Let's see. Maybe I'll read one more hotline poem and then a final poem. Hotline. When she asks, "Are you a survivor too?" I do not say. I have been trained not to answer that. On the page, I have learned confession is another mask. When she asks, "What do you do when you can't sleep?" I don't explain how I walk around my town in the middle of the night to remind myself. I say, we're safe. We count our breaths together. I hold on while she goes to get an ice cube, goes to the bathroom, cries, murmurs, maybe even sleeps. Are you still there? She asks, are you there? The self calling the self back. The poem I was trying to make. I'm here. I'm here. We take turns saying. Finish with this one. Waiting for sleep, I imagine Sita in her youth. She hid all day in a tree, ate guavas rubbed with salt and pepper, stalked the long-haired cat, begged for rotis, ghee, and sugar, watched as her mother dressed, bangles stacking her arms like gauntlets. From the window, she could see women from every corner of the city walk into the river, disappear, then rise clean, saris soaking. She drank milk from a hammered brass cup. Around her aunts, cousins unrolled their sleeping mats. Of course, a woman oiled her hair. Of course, a woman lined her eyes. The inner world was made of women. They filled her stomach, mouth, breath. What do I need to see embroidered in my mind's own dark? This girl, young enough to fall asleep, this dream taking her into its current, so we might both rise ready to ring out the story.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely hearing, not just reading them, but then hearing you read them. I think before, since we were speaking of place before, a final question from Carolina Ebed. If you're willing, of course, she wants to know what your writing space is like and if you have any talismans you can tell us about.
My writing space, I have an office in our house, which is actually sort of a glorified hallway. But often I'm here alone, and so that's fine. But I find I'm a migratory writer. I move around the house, so I don't actually end up in just one space. I can't write in cafes or public spaces very well. I have many friends who love to go to a coffee shop and write. But for me, I need a lot of silence and I need some sense of privacy to do my work. But I do roam about our space and I'm not always in the same place. But I do have some talismans that I like to keep. I have a chunk of railroad that came from Namibia. I have a picture of my father. I have a pen that is a favorite pen. I like to start on paper if I can. And so notebooks are plentiful in all the corners of our house. I like the plainest, least lovely notebooks I can find. Somehow they are the most inviting and least intimidating for me to get started with. So I have many of those like old college bound, hardcover notebooks everywhere. So those are some of the things that populate my writing zones.
I think that's, I discovered, I started buying beautiful notebooks, and then I discovered I found them intimidating. I didn't want to ruin them.
Yes.
Somehow. So yeah, those, when I go to America, I buy those black and white college notebooks. I like them.
Yes.
I do. Well, this has been a really special evening, Kirun. I'm so glad to have been able to launch this wonderful book with you. I am going to remind people that Women in the Waiting Room is published by Black Lawrence Press. You can buy it from them. You can buy it from Amazon, but you could also buy it from your local independent bookstore, which are especially good businesses, I think, to support in these times if you can. So thank you all so much for coming. Thanks to 5x15. And again, thank you, Kirun. It's been wonderful to meet you. I will see you at Goldsmiths in November. Yes. I will tweet about that. And also I'd like to say, if people want to watch this again, I know that a link will be put up, and we will tweet and social media about that. So thank you so much, Kirun, and good night to everyone.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. It's a joy to have been with everyone today.